The marriage license was sitting in my email inbox on a Tuesday morning, forwarded by a county clerk's office I never contacted, from a records request I never filed. My hands were still wrapped around my coffee mug when I opened it, expecting a routine notification about my own divorce paperwork finally clearing the system. Instead, I was looking at a certificate with 2 names on it that made my stomach drop through the kitchen floor. My ex-husband's name on one line, my mother's name on the other. Dated 14 days after my divorce decree became final. I read it 3 times before I understood I wasn't misreading a stranger's document that had landed in my inbox by mistake. I was reading proof that the 2 people I trusted most in this world had been planning a wedding while I was still packing boxes out of the house we shared for 9 years. Welcome back to The Dramatic Story, where we tell the kind of family stories that stay with you long after the credits roll. My name is Meredith Calloway. I'm 34 years old, and for most of my life I believed betrayal came from strangers, from people who had no reason to protect you in the first place. I learned this year that the deepest cuts come from the 2 people who are supposed to stand closest to you when everything else falls apart. If a story has ever made you sit up straight and whisper, "How did she not see it coming?" you're in the right place. Drop a comment telling me where you're watching from, and stay with me, because what happened after that email is a story I still have trouble believing myself, even though I lived every second of it. I want to take you back 6 months before that email arrived, to the night I finally signed my divorce papers in a lawyer's office that smelled like burnt coffee and printer toner. My marriage to Daniel Whitcomb had been dying slowly for almost 2 years before either of us admitted it out loud. We met in our late 20s at a mutual friend's engagement party, and for the first 4 years it felt like the kind of love people write songs about. He was charming in that effortless way some men are, the kind of charm that makes strangers feel like old friends within minutes of meeting him. He worked in commercial insurance, made steady money, and remembered small details about my day that I mentioned only once in passing. My mother adored him from the very first dinner I brought him to, which at the time felt like the greatest blessing a daughter could ask for. She used to say Daniel was the son she never had, and I laughed every time she said it, never once imagining those words carried a weight I couldn't see. The unraveling started small, the way these things always do. Late nights at the office that stretched longer than any insurance job should require. A distance in his voice when I asked simple questions about his day. A gradual coldness that crept into our bed until we were sleeping like 2 strangers who happened to share a mattress. I tried counseling first, because that's what responsible adults do when a marriage starts cracking. Daniel sat through 4 sessions with his arms crossed, answering every question with the shortest possible sentence, and by the 5th session he stopped showing up entirely. I filed for divorce 11 months ago, and what followed was the kind of grinding, exhausting legal battle nobody prepares you for. Arguments over furniture that neither of us actually wanted. A fight over a car that sat unused in a storage lot for months while our lawyers traded emails. I lost 12 pounds that year without trying, the stress eating away at me in ways I didn't fully register until my sister pointed out how loose my clothes had gotten. Through all of it, my mother was the one constant I thought I could hold on to. Patricia Calloway had always been a formidable presence in my life, the kind of mother who showed up uninvited with groceries when she sensed I was struggling, who called every single day just to check on my mood. During the divorce, she became something closer to a lifeline. She sat across from me at my kitchen table, more nights than I can count, pouring 2 glasses of wine and telling me Daniel never deserved someone as good as me. She said it so often, with such conviction, that I never once questioned the sincerity behind it. She helped me pack boxes when I finally moved out of the house Daniel and I bought together. She sat beside me in the lawyer's waiting room the day I signed the final papers, squeezing my hand when the clerk called my name. But looking back now, and I mean really looking back with the kind of clarity that only comes after the floor has already caved in beneath you, there were things about those final weeks that never quite added up. My mother started declining invitations to dinner that we'd had standing for years, claiming exhaustion or a headache, or simply that she wasn't feeling social. She grew strangely defensive whenever I vented about Daniel's behavior during the divorce, softening his cruelty in ways that felt almost protective, telling me things like, "He's probably just scared," or "Divorce brings out the worst in people. Don't hold it against him forever." At the time, I chalked it up to her trying to keep the peace, trying to model forgiveness for me, even when I wasn't ready to hear it. I told myself she was being the bigger person, teaching me by example not to let bitterness calcify into something permanent. I had no idea I was watching a woman carefully manage the optics of a betrayal already well underway, smoothing the edges of a lie so it wouldn't cut too deep before she was ready for me to feel it. The day the final decree cleared, I remember standing in the parking lot outside the courthouse and feeling something close to peace for the first time in almost a year. I called my mother from my car, my voice shaking with relief, and told her it was finally over. She was quiet for a beat longer than felt natural before she said, "Congratulations, honey. You deserve to be happy now." I didn't catch the strangeness in her tone that day. I was too busy breathing for what felt like the first time in months, too busy believing the worst chapter of my adult life had finally closed. I had no idea that somewhere across town, in an office I would never see, my mother and my ex-husband were already discussing dates, already planning a future that had been quietly built on the ashes of the one I thought I still had a chance to rebuild. 14 days. That's the number that would come to define everything I thought I knew about my family. 14 days between the moment a judge declared my marriage legally over and the moment my mother stood in front of an officiant and promised to love, honor, and cherish the same man I had just spent a year fighting to leave behind. I didn't know that number yet, not when I hung up the phone in that parking lot, feeling lighter than I had in months. I wouldn't know it for another 6 weeks, when a records request I never filed would land in my inbox and rewrite everything I thought was true about the two people I trusted most in the world. The divorce proceedings themselves deserve their own telling, because nobody warns you how much of your dignity gets stripped away in a process that's supposed to give you your life back. My lawyer, a sharp woman named Rosalind Fenwick who'd handled hundreds of cases just like mine, once told me during a particularly brutal negotiation session that divorce doesn't end a marriage so much as it performs an autopsy on one, and every single organ gets weighed and measured in front of strangers. I sat through depositions where Daniel's attorney asked me to account for every dollar I'd spent in the last 3 years of our marriage, as if grief and exhaustion could be itemized on a spreadsheet. I sat through mediation sessions where Daniel stared past me at a spot on the wall, refusing to meet my eyes even when we were discussing who would keep the dog we'd adopted together during our 2nd year of marriage. He got the dog, incidentally. I didn't fight for her, because fighting had already cost me more than I had left to give. What I remember most clearly from those 11 months isn't the paperwork, or the lawyers, or even the late nights crying into a wine glass at my kitchen table. It's the specific texture of exhaustion that settles into your bones when you're grieving something that technically hasn't died yet. Daniel and I would still run into each other at mutual friends' gatherings during the separation, both of us performing civility for an audience that had no idea how badly things had actually fractured behind closed doors. He'd smile at me across a crowded room, ask how I was holding up in that same charming voice that used to make strangers feel like old friends, and I'd smile back and say I was fine, because what else do you say when the alternative is falling apart in front of people who used to celebrate your anniversary with you? My mother watched all of this unfold from what I believed was the closest possible vantage point a parent could have. She came to nearly every hearing that allowed observers, sitting in the back row of a courtroom that smelled like old carpet and stale coffee, offering me a small nod of encouragement whenever I glanced back at her for reassurance. She texted me good morning messages every single day of that year, small check-ins that felt like anchors in a storm I couldn't see the end of. I remember one night in particular, maybe 4 months into the proceedings, when I called her sobbing after Daniel's lawyer sent over a particularly aggressive settlement demand that would have left me with almost nothing to rebuild my life. My mother drove across town at 11 at night, showed up at my apartment in her pajamas with a bag of groceries she'd apparently grabbed on impulse, and sat with me on my couch until 3 in the morning, telling me over and over that I was going to be fine, that Daniel would eventually get exactly what he deserved, that karma had a way of finding people who treated good women badly. I believed every word of it, because why wouldn't I? This was my mother, the woman who taught me to ride a bike, who sat through every school play and soccer game of my childhood, who called me her whole world more times than I could count over 3 decades. There was no version of reality in my mind where those late-night comfort sessions could exist alongside a secret she was actively building with the very man she was helping me survive. Looking back now, with the clarity that hindsight so cruelly provides, I can see the small inconsistencies I brushed past without a second thought. She always seemed to know details about Daniel's schedule that I hadn't mentioned to her. Small things like which nights he worked late or when he'd be traveling for a conference. At the time, I assumed she was simply paying close attention to everything I told her, the way an attentive mother does when her daughter is going through the hardest year of her life. I never once imagined she might have another source for that information entirely. There was a specific evening about 7 months into the divorce that I've replayed in my mind more times than I can count since the truth came out. My mother invited me over for what she called a girls' night, just the two of us, wine and takeout and a movie neither of us actually watched. Partway through the evening, her phone buzzed on the coffee table between us, and she snatched it up faster than I'd ever seen her move, angling the screen away from my line of sight before quickly typing a response and setting it face down. I asked her, half joking, who she was texting so urgently on a Friday night. She laughed it off, said it was just her book club coordinating next month's pick, and changed the subject so smoothly I didn't think twice about it. I know now, with the sick clarity of someone who has since seen the actual text records pulled during a very different kind of investigation, exactly who she was messaging that night, and exactly what they were planning while I sat 3 feet away eating cold noodles out of a takeout container. The strangest part of it all, the part that still keeps me awake some nights turning it over in my mind, is how my mother's advice during that final stretch of the divorce started to shift in ways I couldn't quite name at the time. Where she'd once been fiercely protective of me, calling Daniel every name under the sun during our earliest conversations about the separation, she gradually became more measured, more careful with her words whenever his name came up. She'd say things like, "You know, people change when they're scared," or, "Maybe he's not entirely the villain here, honey. Relationships are complicated." I remember feeling a flicker of confusion during these moments, a small internal voice asking why my staunchest ally was suddenly softening her stance on the man who'd made the final year of my marriage a slow-motion catastrophe. I dismissed that voice every single time, telling myself my mother was simply trying to model grace and forgiveness, trying to teach me not to let anger consume the next chapter of my life. I had no framework for imagining the real reason behind her sudden diplomacy, because the real reason was so far outside anything I believed possible for the woman who raised me. By the time the final decree came through, I had convinced myself the worst was finally behind me. I had a new apartment I was slowly making my own, a job that kept me busy enough to avoid dwelling too long on the wreckage of the last 2 years, and a mother who I believed was standing beside me through every single step of the rebuild. I had no reason to suspect that the ground beneath that belief was already hollow, that the woman pouring me wine and telling me I deserved better had already decided, in secret, exactly who deserved him instead. The peace I felt in that courthouse parking lot on the day my divorce was finalized was real, but it was built on a foundation I didn't yet know was cracked straight through the middle. It would take 6 more weeks, 1 misdirected email from a county records office, and a single document with 2 familiar names on it before I understood just how far that crack actually ran, and just how long it had been widening in the dark, while I sat beside my mother, believing I had never been more protected in my entire life. The email that started everything arrived on a random Tuesday morning while I was standing in my kitchen in sweatpants, waiting for coffee to finish brewing before another ordinary day at work. I want to be honest about how it happened, because the truth is almost too strange to believe. 6 weeks after my divorce was finalized, I'd submitted a routine public records request through my county's website, trying to get a certified copy of my own decree for an insurance beneficiary update at work. Somewhere in that system, whether through human error or a glitch nobody could later explain to my satisfaction, the county clerk's office sent me a secondary document tied to the same case number. It wasn't my paperwork at all. It was a marriage license, filed and recorded in the very same county, dated 14 days after my divorce became final. I remember opening the attachment with zero suspicion, expecting to see my own decree staring back at me. Instead, I was looking at a certificate bearing my ex-husband's full legal name on one line, and directly beneath it, in the same clean county font, my mother's full legal name on the other. I sat down on my kitchen floor because my legs simply stopped working the way legs are supposed to work. I remember the tile was cold against the back of my thighs, and I remember staring at that screen for what felt like an hour, but was probably closer to 90 seconds, waiting for my brain to produce some rational explanation that would make the words rearrange themselves into something that made sense. Maybe it was a different Daniel Whitcomb. Maybe there was another Patricia Calloway somewhere in this county who happened to share my mother's exact name and my mother's exact middle initial. I opened my phone with hands that weren't entirely steady and typed my mother's name into a public records search, the kind of database anyone can access for a small fee if they know where to look. Within 4 minutes, I had my answer confirmed twice over, in county records and in a secondary state database that cross-referenced marriage filings. There was no other Patricia Calloway. There was no mistake in the system. My mother had married my ex-husband, and she had done it so quickly after my divorce finalized that the ink on my own decree had barely had time to dry. I did the only thing I know how to do when the ground disappears beneath me, which is exactly what I did during the divorce itself. I started gathering evidence, methodically, the way you're supposed to approach any situation where your own eyes and memory can no longer be fully trusted. I pulled up my mother's social media, an account she rarely updated because she always said she preferred calling people over posting for strangers to see. I hadn't checked it in months, and what I found when I finally scrolled back through the last several weeks made my stomach drop a second time that morning. There was a photo, posted only to close friends but somehow still visible to me because I'd never been removed from that list, of my mother standing on a small stone patio somewhere with a bouquet of white peonies in her hands. The caption read simply, "The happiest day, finally." I zoomed in on the background of that photo without fully understanding what I was looking for, until I saw it clearly enough to confirm what the marriage certificate had already told me. Behind her, slightly out of focus but unmistakable, stood Daniel, wearing the same navy suit he'd worn to my cousin's wedding 3 years earlier, back when he was still my husband and she was still just his mother-in-law. I sat in that kitchen for close to 3 hours that morning, missing work entirely without bothering to call in, scrolling through every piece of digital evidence I could find. I found a handful of comments on that photo from people I recognized as Daniel's coworkers, people offering congratulations with exclamation points and heart emojis, people who clearly had no idea they were congratulating him on marrying his ex-wife's mother, or perhaps they knew exactly what they were congratulating and simply didn't care enough to think twice about it. I found a second photo, older, buried further back in the account's history, time-stamped from nearly 4 months before my divorce even finalized. It showed my mother and Daniel at what looked like a quiet dinner, seated close together at a small table with candlelight between them, her hand resting on his forearm in a way that no in-law relationship requires. The caption on that older photo had been vague, something about celebrating good news with good company, and I remembered seeing it pass through my feed back when it was posted and thinking absolutely nothing of it, because why would I? My mother having dinner with my soon-to-be ex-husband during a contentious separation seemed strange in hindsight, but at the time I assumed she was simply trying to keep the peace between the two of us for practical reasons, maybe discussing furniture logistics or trying to smooth over some detail of the settlement. What strikes me now, looking back at those months I spent believing my mother was the one constant source of unconditional support in my life, is how completely I had misread the entire architecture of our relationship, without a single visible crack to warn me. For years, decades even, my mother had positioned herself as my closest confidant, the person I called first with good news, and the person I cried to first with bad news. During the darkest stretch of my marriage's collapse, she had been the one holding the flashlight while I stumbled through the wreckage. Or so I believed. What I hadn't understood, what I couldn't have understood without the evidence sitting right in front of me on that kitchen floor, was that the very same woman offering me comfort at 11 at night was simultaneously building an entirely separate life with the man causing my pain in the first place. She wasn't just failing to protect me, she was actively constructing something behind my back, using the raw material of my own suffering as cover. I called her that afternoon, hands shaking so badly I had to set the phone down on the counter and put her on speaker just to keep from dropping it. She answered on the third ring with her usual warm hello, the same voice she'd used 1,000 times before to soothe me through every crisis of my adult life. I asked her directly, without any preamble, whether she had married Daniel. There was a silence on the line that lasted long enough for me to hear my own heartbeat in my ears, and then she exhaled slowly and said, in a tone so calm it made my skin crawl, that she'd been meaning to tell me, that things simply happened faster than either of them expected, that she hoped I could eventually understand how these things sometimes unfold in life. She did not apologize. She did not ask if I was okay. She spoke about it the way you might describe an unexpected job offer, something that arrived on its own timeline and had to be accepted before the window closed. I remember asking her how long, my voice barely a whisper by that point, and she paused again before admitting that she and Daniel had grown close, as she put it, sometime before the divorce was even filed. Sometime before. 2 words that rewrote every single memory I had of that final year of my marriage. Every late-night comfort session, every wine glass poured, every gentle defense of a man she claimed to despise. I hung up the phone without saying another word, and I sat on that kitchen floor until the sun went down, trying to understand how 2 people I trusted, more than anyone else on earth, had managed to build an entire secret life inside the ruins of the one I thought I was still fighting to save. I did not sleep that night, or the night after, or really for the better part of 2 weeks. Instead, I did what I always do when the world stops making sense, which is I started building a timeline. I pulled out an old notebook I'd used during the divorce to track legal deadlines and settlement dates, and I turned to a fresh page and began writing down every single memory I could dredge up from the last 3 years of my marriage that now, in the harsh light of what I knew, looked entirely different than it had at the time. I wanted to understand not just what had happened, but how long it had actually been happening, because there is a specific kind of grief that comes from realizing a betrayal wasn't a single moment of weakness, but a slow, deliberate architecture, built brick by brick, while you were looking directly at the people laying the foundation. The first memory I circled in that notebook was a girls' trip my mother and I took to a lake house nearly 2 years before my divorce was even filed, back when Daniel and I were still technically happy, or at least performing happiness well enough that neither of us had said the word divorce out loud yet. My mother had proposed the trip herself, said she'd found a wonderful little rental through a friend, and wanted just the 2 of us to get away for a long weekend. I remembered being surprised at the time, because my mother rarely traveled anywhere without at least mentioning it to half the family first, and this particular trip had come together with unusual speed and secrecy, booked and paid for within a single week. What I hadn't known then, what I only pieced together after pulling old bank statements during my post-discovery investigation, was that Daniel had been at a work conference less than 40 minutes from that same lake house during the exact 3 days my mother and I were supposedly having quality mother-daughter time. I found a credit card charge from a restaurant near that lake house, dated the middle night of our trip, a dinner for two, time-stamped at 9 in the evening, hours after my mother had told me she was too tired from our hike that day and wanted to turn in early while I stayed up reading on the porch alone. Once I started pulling that thread, I couldn't stop finding more of it woven through years of memories I'd never once thought to question. There was a family barbecue at my parents' house, maybe 18 months before the divorce filing, where I remembered feeling a strange flicker of discomfort, watching my mother and Daniel laugh together in the kitchen, while I helped my father set up chairs in the backyard. At the time, I'd chalked it up to my mother simply being warm and welcoming toward her son-in-law, the kind of easy affection a good mother-in-law shows the man her daughter loves. Looking back at it now, replaying the memory with fresh eyes, I remember the specific way my mother had touched his arm when she laughed, a gesture too familiar, too comfortable, the kind of touch that exists between people who have shared far more private moments than a family barbecue. I remember Daniel glancing toward the backyard window at one point, checking to see whether I could see them through the glass, and at the time I'd interpreted that glance as him simply making sure I wasn't being left out. I understand now he was checking whether he'd been caught. There was a Thanksgiving dinner, maybe a year before everything fell apart, where my mother had insisted on hosting, even though it had been my turn in our informal family rotation. She'd been oddly insistent about it, calling me 3 separate times to explain why the holiday needed to happen at her house that particular year, citing kitchen renovations at my place that in hindsight were entirely fabricated, since I never once scheduled any such renovation. I remember Daniel volunteering to help her in the kitchen for almost the entire afternoon, while the rest of the family sat in the living room watching football, and I remember thinking nothing of it at the time, beyond a passing thought that he was being unusually helpful that year. My sister mentioned to me much later, after the truth had come out and we were piecing together our own separate timelines of suspicion, that she'd walked into that kitchen at one point, looking for more wine glasses, and found the two of them standing unusually close together near the stove, springing apart the second she entered the room, with an explanation about checking the turkey that neither of them had needed to whisper about. The most damning piece of the timeline, the one that finally confirmed what I had begun to suspect but desperately hoped wasn't true, came from an old email account I'd forgotten I still had access to, through a shared family calendar my mother had set up years earlier, for coordinating holidays and birthdays. Buried in the permissions of that shared calendar was an entry from nearly 8 months before I filed for divorce, a private appointment my mother had labeled simply as PC and DW, dinner, 7:30. A location I recognized as a small restaurant clear across town from where either of them lived or worked. The kind of place you choose specifically because you're unlikely to run into anyone who knows you. I sat with that discovery for a long time, doing the math over and over in my head, subtracting months and counting backwards, trying to understand exactly how much of my marriage had already been a performance by the time I finally worked up the courage to file the paperwork that ended it. What this timeline revealed, laid out in cold chronological order on the pages of my notebook, was not a betrayal that began after my marriage ended. It was a betrayal that had been quietly constructed for well over a year before I ever set foot in a lawyer's office, meaning every single conversation my mother and I had during the darkest stretch of my divorce, every comfort she offered, every late-night wine glass poured while she told me Daniel didn't deserve someone as good as me, had been delivered by a woman who was already secretly building a life with him. My marriage hadn't simply ended in betrayal. It had been a facade for the final stretch of its existence, propped up by two people who knew exactly what they were doing, while I remained the only person in the equation who genuinely believed the story we were all supposedly living inside. Understanding that timeline didn't just break my heart a second time. It rewrote the entire history of my adult life, turning years of memories I'd cherished into evidence I now had to examine for cracks I should have noticed but never had the reason or the cruelty of imagination to look for. The confrontation itself happened 3 days after that first phone call, once I'd had enough time to gather myself and enough evidence assembled that I refused to let either of them talk their way around what I already knew. I asked my mother to meet me at a coffee shop near my apartment, deliberately choosing public ground because some instinct told me I needed witnesses around me, even strangers who had no idea what was unfolding at a corner table, just to keep myself grounded in reality, while the two people I trusted most tried to reshape my understanding of what had happened. She arrived looking exactly as composed as she always did, dressed in the soft cardigan she'd worn to half my childhood memories, and for one disorienting second, I felt the old pull toward her, the muscle memory of a daughter who wanted comfort from her mother. That pull lasted exactly as long as it took her to sit down across from me and say, before I'd even opened my mouth, that she hoped I wasn't going to make this harder than it needed to be. I laid the printed marriage certificate on the table between us, along with the timeline I'd written out in my notebook, dates circled in red ink beside the memories they corresponded to. I asked her plainly how long she had been involved with Daniel before my divorce was even filed. She sighed the way you sigh at a child asking the same question for the third time, and she told me that these things don't happen on a schedule, that feelings develop slowly and neither of them had planned for any of it, that she understood this was difficult for me to hear, but she hoped I could eventually see it from a place of maturity rather than anger. I asked her directly about the lake house trip, about the dinner reservation in her calendar from 8 months before I filed, about the Thanksgiving she'd insisted on hosting. She didn't deny a single detail. She simply reframed each one, calling the lake house trip a coincidence of scheduling, calling the calendar entry an old friend she was catching up with, calling the Thanksgiving kitchen moment an innocent conversation about gravy that my sister had apparently misread. Every single explanation was delivered in the same calm, measured voice she'd used to soothe me through 1,000 smaller crises, and that voice, the one I'd trusted my entire life, was the thing that finally broke something loose in my chest that I don't think will ever fully mend. What struck me hardest in that coffee shop wasn't the lies themselves, because by that point I'd expected some version of denial or deflection. It was the complete absence of anything resembling remorse in her posture, in her tone, in the way she kept checking her phone, as though this conversation, this reckoning with her own daughter, over a betrayal of staggering proportion, was simply one item on a busy afternoon she needed to move through efficiently. I asked her if she loved him, and she said yes without a single flicker of hesitation, as though the question itself was almost insulting in its obviousness. I asked her if she had ever, even once, considered what this would do to me, and for the first time in the entire conversation, something shifted in her expression, not guilt exactly, but a kind of weary irritation, the look you give someone who is inconveniencing you with their feelings. She said, and I remember this exact sentence because I have replayed it in my mind more times than I can count since, that she'd raised me to be strong enough to handle life's complications, and she trusted I would eventually find my way to forgiveness once the initial shock wore off. I called Daniel that same evening, less because I expected a different response, and more because I needed to hear whatever justification he'd constructed for himself, needed to look the shape of his cruelty directly in the face, rather than let it live only in my imagination. He answered on the second ring, his voice carrying that same easy charm that used to make strangers feel like old friends within minutes, and when I asked him how long he had been involved with my mother, he didn't even bother with the careful reframing my mother had attempted. He simply said, with a casualness that took my breath away, that our marriage had been over long before either of us admitted it, and that what happened next was really no one's business but his and Patricia's. He used her first name, not mother-in-law, not even her full name, just Patricia, spoken with the easy familiarity of a man discussing his fiancée, which of course by that point she already was. I asked him if he felt any guilt at all, and he said, almost gently, as if he were doing me some kind of favor by being honest, that he didn't see the point in feeling guilty about falling in love, that guilt was a wasted emotion when the outcome was ultimately going to happen, with or without his permission. I sat in my car outside that coffee shop long after my mother had walked away, and later that same night I sat on my apartment floor for the second time in less than a week, trying to reconcile the two people who had just spoken to me with the two people who had shaped almost every meaningful memory of my adult life. There was no shouting in either conversation, no dramatic scene, no tearful confession or desperate plea for forgiveness. There was only a strange, hollow calm on their end, the calm of people who had already made peace with their decision long before I ever found out about it. People who had spent months, perhaps longer, rehearsing exactly how they would explain this away if the truth ever surfaced. What I understood in that moment, sitting alone on my apartment floor with the marriage certificate still folded in my jacket pocket, was that I hadn't just lost a husband and gained an absence where my mother used to be. I had lost the version of both of them I believed existed, the versions who loved me enough to never do something like this, and in their place stood two strangers wearing familiar faces, entirely unbothered by the wreckage they'd left behind in the process of building their own happiness on top of it. The days after that double confrontation blurred together in a way I still find difficult to describe accurately, but the ripple effect through the rest of my family arrived with a speed that genuinely surprised me. My sister, Vanessa, called me within hours of my mother's own phone call to the extended family, announcing the marriage as though it were simply good news that had arrived a little unexpectedly. Vanessa's voice on the phone was shaking with a fury I hadn't heard from her since we were teenagers, fighting over borrowed clothes, and she told me she'd already said things to our mother she wasn't sure she could ever take back. Words like disgusting and unforgivable. Words she'd never once used against our mother in 30 years of occasionally difficult but fundamentally loving family history. My father, divorced from my mother for almost a decade by that point and remarried himself, called me, sounding genuinely stunned, saying he never imagined Patricia capable of something like this, even accounting for everything he'd learned about her during their own marriage's collapse years earlier. What I hadn't expected, what nobody prepares you for in a betrayal this specific and this rare, was the way the rest of my extended family would splinter into camps almost overnight, each relative forced into a position they never asked for and never wanted. My Aunt Ruth, my mother's own younger sister, called me sobbing, torn between decades of sisterly loyalty and the plain horror of what her sister had done to her own daughter. She told me she loved me, that she was disgusted by what my mother had done, but she also admitted, in a moment of raw honesty I both appreciated and resented in equal measure, that she didn't know if she could fully cut her sister out of her life over this, that blood loyalty ran deeper than she wished it did in moments like this. I remember hanging up that call and sitting with a very specific, very isolating realization that even the people who loved me, who were horrified on my behalf, were still calculating how much of their own relationship with my mother they were willing to sacrifice in solidarity with me. Nobody's betrayal costs them nothing. Everyone in that family had a version of my mother they still wanted to preserve, even while agreeing that what she'd done to me was monstrous. My cousins split almost evenly, some cutting off contact with my mother entirely and reaching out to me with genuine tenderness, others going quiet in a way that felt like its own kind of betrayal, a refusal to pick a side, dressed up as staying neutral. I learned very quickly that neutrality, in a situation like this, isn't actually neutral at all. It's a choice, and every person who chose to remain politely silent, who continued liking my mother's social media posts or wishing her a happy birthday in the months that followed, was making a decision about whose feelings mattered more in this equation, and it was rarely mine. Stopped attending family gatherings entirely for a stretch of nearly 4 months, unable to sit in a room where I might be expected to make small talk with people who still spoke to my mother as though nothing catastrophic had happened. Still saw her at holidays, still treated her marriage to my ex-husband as an awkward but ultimately tolerable family footnote rather than the specific act of cruelty it actually was. The psychological weight of losing both a husband and a mother to the same act of betrayal is not something I had language for until I found myself sitting across from a therapist, trying to explain why grief for two entirely different relationships had somehow fused into a single, undifferentiated wound that I couldn't locate the edges of. Losing a marriage is its own particular grief, one that at least follows a somewhat familiar cultural script, one that friends know how to comfort you through because divorce, while painful, is common enough that people have language for it. There is no comparable script for losing your mother to your ex-husband. There is no greeting card, no support group specifically designed for this, no friend who has ever experienced exactly what you're going through and can tell you it gets easier because they made it to the other side themselves. I remember explaining to my therapist that the hardest part wasn't even the betrayal itself, but the fact that every single memory I had of my mother comforting me through the divorce now felt retroactively poisoned, meaning I couldn't even grieve the marriage cleanly because the person who had helped me survive it turned out to be the architect of an even deeper wound waiting underneath. It took roughly 2 months before I made the decision that finally gave me something resembling solid ground to stand on, and that decision was full no contact with both of them, formalized in a way I had never imagined needing to formalize a relationship with my own mother. I blocked her number, blocked her email, blocked every social media account either of us had ever used to stay in touch. I changed my own number entirely, a decision that felt dramatic when I first made it, but that I have never once regretted, because within the first month after the confrontation, my mother attempted to reach me through no fewer than 6 different channels, texting from unfamiliar numbers, emailing from a secondary account I didn't know she had, once even showing up unannounced at my workplace before security quietly asked her to leave the lobby. Each attempt was framed in her mind, I later learned through a mutual family member, as an attempt at reconciliation, as though enough persistence would eventually wear down my resistance, the way persistence had presumably worn down whatever objections Daniel might have originally had about beginning an affair with his mother-in-law. I set every boundary I could construct, not out of spite, but out of the simple, exhausting necessity of protecting whatever small piece of stability I had left, because a woman who could justify this kind of betrayal to herself, with such calm certainty, was not a woman I trusted to respect a boundary unless I made it structurally impossible for her to cross. The therapist I eventually found, a woman named Dr. Alyssa Reyes, who specialized in complex family trauma, told me something during our 3rd session together that I have carried with me every single day since. She said most betrayal recovery frameworks are built around a single point of injury, one person who hurt you, one relationship that fractured, and that my situation didn't fit cleanly into any of the standard models because I was essentially processing 2 separate traumas that had been fused by circumstance into something the field didn't have a tidy name for. She used the phrase, compounded betrayal trauma, explaining that when the 2 people who harm you are also each other's co-conspirators, the brain struggles to file the grief in separate folders the way it normally would with unrelated losses. I remember feeling an enormous, almost embarrassing sense of relief just hearing that named out loud, because for 2 months I had privately wondered if I was simply failing to grieve correctly, failing to move through the stages in the order some part of me believed I was supposed to move through them. Hearing a professional confirm that my confusion wasn't a personal failing, but a predictable response to an unusually cruel set of circumstances, gave me the first real permission I'd had to stop rushing myself toward healing. We started with something Dr. Reyes called narrative reconstruction, which in practice meant going back through that same notebook I'd filled with dates and circled memories during my initial investigation, but this time working through it slowly, session by session, not to build a legal case or a timeline of evidence, but to grieve each memory on its own terms. We would sit with the lake house trip for an entire session, and I would talk through what it felt like to believe, at the time, that my mother had chosen me for a quiet weekend of connection, only to now understand she'd been managing a secret affair 40 minutes away the entire time. Dr. Reyes never rushed me past the anger in these sessions, never suggested I should be further along than I was, and that patience taught me something about my own healing that I don't think I could have learned any other way, which is that grief over a betrayal this layered doesn't move in a straight line, and trying to force it into one only delays the actual work being done. Alongside individual therapy, I found a support group that met twice a month specifically for people navigating what the group's founder called generational betrayal, a broader category that included my exact situation but also covered other forms of parent-child betrayal that shattered the ordinary hierarchy of trust a child is raised to expect from a parent. Sitting in that room the first time, listening to other people describe versions of their own impossible family ruptures, was the first moment since the discovery that I felt something other than complete isolation. There was a woman in that group, maybe 10 years older than me, who had discovered her own mother had been secretly financing her brother's gambling addiction for over a decade while lecturing her about financial responsibility, and though the specifics were entirely different from mine, the underlying wound, the realization that a parent's love had always come with an asterisk you never knew existed, felt achingly familiar. I stopped feeling like the only person on earth carrying this particular flavor of grief, and that alone did more for my healing than almost anything else in those early months. The practical steps mattered too, and I want to be honest about how unglamorous most of them actually were. I changed the locks on my apartment, even though my mother never had a key, simply because the act of doing it gave me a physical sense of control I desperately needed after months of feeling like the ground beneath me could shift without warning. I deleted years of photos from my phone, not out of a desire to erase history, but because scrolling past a picture of my mother and me at my wedding, a wedding she attended smiling in the front row, while apparently already several months into an affair with the groom, was doing active damage to my ability to function on ordinary days. I kept a small handful of photos from childhood, the ones from before any of this began, the ones I could look at without feeling the specific nausea of retroactive betrayal, and I let the rest go into a folder I don't open anymore. I started journaling every morning, not elaborate entries, just a few lines about how I felt that day, a practice Dr. Reyes suggested as a way to track my own healing over time, rather than relying on memory alone, which tends to smooth over both the bad days and the good ones until you lose track of how far you've actually come. Somewhere around the 5th month of this process, I noticed something shift that I hadn't expected, which was that I started to feel less like a person defined by what had been done to me, and more like a person who had simply survived something extraordinarily difficult and come out the other side still intact. I began rebuilding small pieces of joy back into my routine, reconnecting with a college friend I'd let the divorce push out of my life entirely, picking up running again after nearly a year of letting my body absorb all the stress I'd been carrying. I found a new apartment in a different part of town, not out of avoidance, but because I wanted a space that had never once held either of them in it, a blank slate where every memory made inside its walls would belong entirely to me. My sister Vanessa and I grew closer than we'd ever been, meeting for dinner every single week without fail, and in those dinners I found something I hadn't expected to find again so soon, which was the specific comfort of being fully known by someone who had chosen, without hesitation, to stand entirely on my side of an impossible line. Healing from this didn't erase what happened, and I don't think it ever fully will, but it taught me that the two people who broke something in me were never the only two people capable of holding it back together. It has been a little over a year now since that email landed in my inbox on an ordinary Tuesday morning, and I want to tell you honestly that the woman writing this to you today is not the same woman who sat on her kitchen floor, unable to make her legs work properly. I still think about that number sometimes. 14 days, the gap between a judge declaring my marriage legally over and my mother standing in front of an officiant, promising to love the same man I had spent nearly a year fighting to leave behind. For a long time, that number felt like the most important detail of the entire story, the piece of evidence that proved beyond any doubt exactly how calculated and how cruel their timing had been. I've come to understand it differently now. 14 days was never really the point. The point was the year and a half before it. The quiet architecture of deception built while I sat across from my mother, believing every wine-poured conversation, every late-night comfort session, every squeeze of the hand in a courtroom was real. 14 days was just the moment the mask finally slipped off, not the moment the betrayal actually began. I moved through this year the way you move through anything genuinely catastrophic, which is slowly, unevenly, and with far more setbacks than any tidy story would suggest. There were mornings, plenty of them, where I woke up and reached for my phone out of pure habit, some old, stubborn part of my brain expecting a good morning text from a mother who no longer existed in my life. There were nights when I still cried over the specific loss of the woman I believed my mother had been, because grieving someone who is still alive, someone who chose this outcome deliberately, carries a particular cruelty that grieving a death simply doesn't. You cannot visit a grave for a person who is still walking around living their life somewhere, and there is no ceremony society has built to help you mourn a mother you have to actively keep out of your life to survive. But I also found, somewhere in the slow accumulation of ordinary days, that I was becoming someone I actually liked being. I finished a certification course I'd abandoned years earlier, during the worst stretch of my marriage, something I'd let slide because Daniel used to make small comments about how it wasn't a practical use of my time. I took it back up entirely on my own terms, and I finished it in 4 months flat, driven by something in me that wanted proof, tangible and undeniable, that I could build things for myself, that neither of them had any part in. I started hosting dinner at my new apartment every few weeks, small gatherings with my sister and the handful of extended family members who had chosen, without hesitation, to stand with me rather than perform some careful neutrality. Watching that table fill up with people who genuinely wanted to be there, who never once made me feel like a burden for needing their loyalty, taught me something my mother apparently never fully absorbed herself, which is that real love doesn't require you to calculate the cost before you decide to show up for someone. I have not spoken to my mother since that coffee shop conversation, and I have not spoken to Daniel since that phone call the same evening. I know, through the same handful of relatives who occasionally mention it without my asking, that they are still married, that they seem, from the outside at least, genuinely happy in the life they built on top of the ruins of mine. For a long time, that knowledge felt like a fresh wound every time it reached me, evidence that somehow they had gotten away with something monstrous and were being rewarded with exactly the kind of contentment I was still fighting to rebuild for myself. Dr. Reyes helped me understand that their happiness, whether real or performed, was never actually mine to carry, that their capacity to live without visible guilt says something profound about who they are, but it says absolutely nothing about my own worth or my own future. Their peace was never proof of my failure. It was simply proof that some people are capable of walking away from destruction they caused without ever once looking back to survey the damage. If you are watching this, and you have lived through some version of this yourself, a betrayal so specific and so layered that you couldn't find language for it anywhere, a wound inflicted by the exact people who were supposed to protect you from wounds like this, I want you to hear this clearly. What was done to you says everything about the people who did it, and absolutely nothing about whether you deserved a different outcome. You did not fail to see it coming because you were foolish. You missed it because you loved people enough to extend them the basic decency of believing they would never do something this cruel, and that instinct, the instinct toward trust, is not a flaw you need to apologize for or armor yourself against for the rest of your life. It simply means you were the only person in the equation who was ever honest. Rebuilding after something like this does not happen in a straight line, and it does not happen on anyone else's timeline but your own. Some days will still ache more than you expect them to, even a year out, even 2 years out, even when you have built a life you are genuinely proud of standing inside. That's not a sign you're healing wrong. That's simply what it looks like to carry something heavy and keep walking anyway. If there is one thing I want you to take from everything I've shared today, it's this. You are allowed to grieve two losses that arrived as one. You are allowed to set boundaries so absolute that people call you dramatic for enforcing them. And you are allowed, eventually, on your own timeline, to build a table full of people who would never once make you question whether you were worth showing up for. That table is possible. I am living proof of it. Thank you for sitting with my story today. If it resonated with you, if you have ever had to rebuild after a betrayal that had no name, drop a comment and tell me your story, because I read every single one, and I promise you, whatever you survived, you are not the only one who understands exactly how heavy it was to carry.